Yes, so welcome to this week's virtual seminar in economic theory. We are very happy to have Elliot Lipnowski, who's presenting optimal political career dynamics, which is joined with Avi Acharya and Joao Ramos, who are also here. We are also very happy to have two panelists. We have Peter Buisseret and Richard van Weelden. As most of you know, the format is that the talk is 1 hour, and then we have a 15-minute Q&A. During the talk, it would be great if you could mute yourselves while you're not talking. And if you could post your questions to the chat, Joao and Avi are going to help with the questions and try and respond to them in the chat. And then you can also ask live questions in the Q&A after the talk. Finally, let me remind you that this talk is recorded. So that's it. Elliot, the screen is yours.
All right. So thank you very much for having me. This lovely seminar series has been, one of the few silver linings of our post-apocalyptic world. So I'm really delighted to be here. This is joint work with, as Julia said, joint work with Avi and Joao from Stanford and Queen Mary, respectively, and they're both happy to take all your difficult questions. So let's get started. The starting point for this paper is, to put it lightly, not new. And it's basically that politicians are subject to moral hazard, right? We have voters who want politicians to serve their interests, serve the voters' interests while politicians are in office. And of course, policy outcomes are going to, in some sense, reflect politician effort, the politician's choices to try to serve voters' interests, but they're only going to do so in an imperfect way. Right? Outcomes are also going to depend on factors that are outside of the control of those in office. And so the classic Farragon model gives us an equilibrium model in which voting behavior is able to incentivize politician effort. And so what Farragon looks at is stationary retention rules, where basically a politician is going to be reelected if and only if their contemporaneous outcome exceeds some threshold, and that threshold is the same history by history. And so what this model gives us is a simple model in which retrospective voting by voters is credible. It happens, in equilibrium, and partially resolves the moral hazard problem. In addition to this class of equilibria and this model being intuitive and seeming descriptively plausible, they're also especially easy to analyze. And this is something that if you want evidence that they're easy to analyze, you can look at the vast literature in the theory of political accountability that has built on this model and extended it in uncountably many directions. So what we're going to do today is basically we're going to look at the same model, to be precise, a stripped down version of the same model, and we're going to focus on a different class of equilibria. So we're not going to think about stationary retention rules, but we're going to ask, what do voter optimal equilibria look like in the Farragon model? All right, so this list of what we do is an accurate summary of the paper and an aspirational summary of the talk in terms of timing. But what we do is we So we first ask sort of what are the dynamics of voter optimal equilibrium? So what does a voter optimal equilibrium of a Farragon model look like on the path of play? And we'll see that the unique up to what happens on path voter optimal equilibrium exhibits rich dynamics. So it's not stationary. And in particular, politicians' job security is going to vary over time and vary in response to shocks. Shocks to the outcomes that voters experience. Now, an important feature that we're going to highlight that occurs in voter optimal equilibrium is entrenchment, by which politicians experience extreme job security and as a consequence put in very low effort following some histories. Now, this is going to lead us, given that entrenchment is a terrible outcome for the voters, this is going to lead us to ask what could happen if voters could renegotiate away from undesirable outcomes. And what we'll see is that constrained voter optimal equilibria exhibit largely similar dynamics, with the important distinction that entrenchment is going to take a softer form. When we sort of endogenize the outside option that enables renegotiation, I'll be clear what I mean about that later. When we endogenize the form of renegotiation, we're going to see that sometimes stationary play is explicitly precluded by renegotiation concerns, and we think this is important given that credibility concerns are one of the leading justifications given for a restriction to stationary play in studying dynamic settings. Okay, so then we're going to extend the model in a couple ways. So one, we're going to ask what happens if politicians can receive outside job offers while they're in office. And so, a reason to look at this now that we have a model of the dynamics of political accountability is that politicians are going to want to take their offers if and only if they're attractive enough relative to their life inside office. If the terms of their life inside office are varying in a history-dependent way, that means that their exit behavior is also going to exhibit dynamics. And so it makes sense to look at this interaction. And what we're going to see in our formal model is that the voter always benefits from a politician taking outside offers, and this is going to give us a new force where the voter would like to have an equilibrium in which the politician is induced to take outside offers. And the basic intuition for why we want this is that I'm going to get effort out of you by either punishing you with eventual firing or rewarding you with eventual tenure, eventual entrenchment. But the latter is very costly to the voter. And so what having outside offers that the politician can take, what that does for the voter is it gives them a way to reward the politician for past effort without having to pay that reward themselves. And so basically outside offers can serve as a cost-efficient way to outsource politician rewards to the private sector. And finally, we extend the model to think about a version of it in which there's some politician heterogeneity. And so there's some adverse selection. And so what we're going to note, so first there's like a previous literature that looking at two-period models shows that if effort and politician ability are complements, there essentially isn't a trade-off between sanctioning and selection, with the intuition being that if you're going to try to solve your selection problem, given this complementarity, that's just going to help you with incentives. What we're going to see is once we have dynamic equilibria, a novel dynamic sanctioning selection trade-off arises, even though I have complementarity between effort and ability. So again, this whole list is aspirational, but we'll see how much we can get through. Okay, so on literature, I'll be brief. So, we're of course an entry to the vast literature on electoral accountability. So rather than doing a shitty job surveying this literature, I just won't try. So here are a couple seminal papers, and here are a couple really nice surveys. Now, I'd say more specifically, there is a literature that looks at non-stationary play and electoral accountability. We're very fortunate to have among our panelists authors of some of the most closely related work for this dimension. And so both Richard's paper and Peter's paper look at models of of electoral accountability in settings with moral hazard and adverse selection. So Richard's paper, so in brief, Richard's paper looks at, is focused on the incumbency advantage, and they study variants of their model that have both with term limits and without term limits, but crucially in the world without term limits, they focus on a class of Markovian equilibria. Peter's paper looks at the limit in which voters and politicians are extremely patient with a view to understanding which sorts of efficiency outcomes are achievable in principle, and getting a beautiful characterization of what's achievable in principle. In contrast, we're interested not in the asymptotic properties as players are patient, but what happens at fixed discounting. And indeed, we're actually going to have our main analysis is going to occur under the restriction that players are not too patient. And moreover, we're not just interested in what are the efficiency outcomes that can be achieved. We actually want to understand the specific dynamics of exactly voter optimal equilibria in our setting and variants thereof. And then, of course, we also join the vast literature of which this is a tiny, set of examples of dynamic moral hazard models. So we're going to be using the standard recursive toolbox for thinking about dynamic moral hazard. And we, like these papers and many others, are going to be thinking about either optimal contracts or Pareto optimal equilibria using a dynamic programming approach and using the results to derive substantive insights for our application of interest. Okay, so let me get to the model, which, as I've said, is not our model. So here it is. So we're going to think about a model with a representative voter and an infinite pool of politicians. And time is discrete, and in every period, so here's kind of the order of moves. So I'm going to have a productivity shock, which is going to take value either 0 or 1, that the politician who's in office in this period is going to observe, and then is going to privately observe. And this shock is IID across periods. Let mu be the probability of the high shock. So now the politician in office, having observed this shock, is going to choose an effort level that we're going to bound to be between 0 and 1. And then the voter's payoff for the period, and which is also the public signal that's observed, is just the product of the two. So in particular, if the shock is 0, then the voter's payoff is 0. And if the shock is 1, then the voter's payoff is equal to the politician's effort. Then the voter, having seen the outcome, having seen the payoff outcome, is going to decide whether to re-elect or replace the politician. So if the politician is replaced, they never re-enter office, which is without loss as far as voter payoffs are concerned. And so then if they're replaced, we get a new politician from the pool. And start over with that politician. Now, politician payoffs are, so first I get a payoff of 0, a continuation payoff of 0 once I'm out of office, which is just a normalization. But while I'm in office, I get an office benefit that we're normalizing to 1, and I pay a constant marginal cost of C for any effort I exert. All right. We're going to assume that there's a common discount factor and that there are public randomizing devices that players can condition on if they want. So let me just highlight the 2 ways in which our model differs from literally the model in Farragon 86. So one is our shock is binary, whereas Farragon looks at a continuous shock. And the second is Farragon looks at effort being unbounded with an increasing marginal cost of effort, whereas we're thinking of effort being bounded with a constant marginal cost of effort. And so basically you can think of what we're doing as a limiting special case of Farragon, where this increasing marginal cost of effort is very close to C up to a point and very close to infinity above that point. And what that point is, we're normalizing to 1. So are there any questions about what the model is? All right, cool. So let me just, as a warm up, let me give you the kind of the bare bones analysis of Farragon's type of equilibria when we're in this stripped down version of his model. So we're going to think about equilibria in which I have some level A hat of success such that the voter will re-elect the politician if and only if the public outcome is at least A hat in a given period. All right. And so I want to ask, when is it in equilibrium for the voter to do more than, for the politician to do more than put in 0 effort? Given such a re-election rule, and then what's the best I can make it? I can do within this class of equilibria. And so given the stationarity, so the politician is going to have a stationary best response, and it's kind of easy to see that the voters only reasonable choices here, the only choices that aren't obviously suboptimal are to shirk, namely to choose 0 every period, no matter what, or to choose an effort level that's equal to 0 if the shock is low and A hat if the shock is high, right? So the reasoning is, first, I'm always going to put in an effort level of 0 if the shock is low, because then my effort isn't affecting the public outcome, and therefore isn't affecting continuation play, but it's still costly for me to put in a higher effort. And so clearly I'll shirk if the effort, if the outcome is 0. If the outcome is 1, well, I'm not going to be rewarded for putting in an effort level higher than A hat, so I shouldn't put in an effort level A hat. And moreover, if I were going to put in an effort level strictly below A hat, I'm going to get fired anyway, so why don't I just make it 0 effort and save on costs? And so these are the only things that I would consider doing as a politician. And so if I shirk, then what's going to happen is I'll get I'm in office, I'm going to get my 1 period of office benefit. So 1 times the scale factor for contemporaneous payoffs. And then I'm definitely going to be fired tomorrow. And so this is my continuation payoff. Now, what if I work? Where by working, I mean choosing this. Well, then, so I think about what happens in the current period. I get my office benefit, but I pay a cost. Now, I only pay a cost of effort if the shock ends up being high. And moreover, I only live to see another day if the shock was high. But in that event, I get a continuation value of U again, because everything is stationary. And so you can rearrange this all for a formula for U. And so working is going to be IC if and only if this is greater than or equal to this, which just rearranges to A hat being below this constant. All right. So this is, a stripped down version of Farragon. Now let me point out that it's kind of useful to demarcate two cases. So in one case, delta is above C. So if delta is weakly greater than C, then what this says is I can make this A hat equal to 1 and get IC. If I can make this A hat equal to 1 and it's IC, I'm getting first best for the voter, right? I'm getting high effort in every period in which effort has a non-zero marginal product. And so, basically the case where delta is greater than or equal to C is a good world for the voter and a world in which we have nothing interesting to say. All right, so for the rest of the talk, let's take it as a standing assumption that delta is less than C. And so that in particular, I can't, get first best with the first equilibrium you would brainstorm. So now, in this case, we have an explicit form for the best stationary equilibrium. I just set A hat equal to delta over C, which is an interior effort level. All right.
So I don't know if this is the right place to ask this, but so obviously this is, as you said, a stripped down version of Farajan. If you took the original version of Farajan, the stationary equilibrium typically won't achieve the first best. Do you know if it's ever going to be the optimal, or if non-stationary equilibria always outperform it there too?
I believe when effort is unbounded, so when effort is unbounded, so that you can't get first best physically. Yeah. So I don't know. We haven't checked, but I strongly suspect you can get a result that says at any fixed delta, first stationary equilibria are strictly suboptimal. Yeah. That's but again, take this as a guess as opposed to a theorem. So that's what I think. Okay, and so great. So let me just point out that it is possible to do better by providing some dynamic incentives. At this point in the talk, you would have expected this is so. So rather than walking you through some boring numerical example, let me just I won't do the calculations. Let me just tell you here's a type of equilibrium that can do better for some parameter values. I'm going to give the politician a 1-period test, and basically, if in the first period they give me a first best outcome, then I will tenure them, and otherwise I will fire them. And so basically I'm maxing out my ability to incentivize the highest possible effort out of the politician in the first period. And when I fire them, I do the same thing with the next politician who's in office. And so we have, for some parameter values, this thing does strictly better. So again, the first non-stationary thing you would think of can do strictly better sometimes than the Farajan equilibrium. But again, I'll spare you the algebra. So are there any questions at this moment before I move on to our characterization of voter optimal equilibrium?
So here we're looking at non-stationary equilibria for the voter, but because it's pure moral hazard, is that equivalent to if the voter had commitment power and was committing to the optimal contract?
Yes, it is. Thank you. So yes, so exactly. So in this pure moral hazard setting, although we'll actually see that in a setting with, we look at a specific setting later on, where we have some adverse selection, and even there, we get this equivalence. But the first observation of that helps us characterize the equilibrium payoff set is that it's super easy to punish our voter. So basically, there's always going to exist an equilibrium. Basically, take our A hat equilibrium where I set A hat equal to 0. And now I have an equilibrium in which the voter gets a first worst outcome. All right, so given that this equilibrium exists, that the voter isn't behaving simultaneously to anybody else, and that the voter has no private information, it's really easy to punish the voter for any deviation. And therefore, I can basically, as far as outcomes are concerned, ignore voter IC. And so we're just looking now at a contracting problem where the voter is the principal. But again, this is, this is an equivalence result, not an assumption. So now let's think about that about that optimal contracting problem. All right. So next, let's observe that without loss, the politician uses a pure strategy. Right. So the intuition for this is really simple. So I'm now just thinking about this problem where the voter has commitment. And so I just need to think about politician incentives. Suppose the politician wanted to mix between 2 or 5 or 7 effort levels at some history. Well, each of those induces some continuation payoff, like some payoff, including that effort choice and the continuation play that follows for the voter. The voter likes one of them best. So have the politician just choose the one that the voter likes best. And I found a weakly better equilibrium in which the politician isn't mixing at this history. And so I can, do this history by history, and I get an equilibrium that's weakly payoff better, in which the politician uses a pure strategy. Next, by the reasoning that I walked through in the stationary equilibrium, the politician always has to choose 0 when the shock is 0. Right? They're not affecting the public outcome, and so you can't provide incentives to them. Not that it would be valuable for you to do so anyway. Okay. So now what this means is that, so when I combine these two, I can think of any history. So sort of we're in a given period, we're at a given history, I have a given politician in office. I can think of the play of the politician in terms of one number. And it's basically, what effort level do I want the politician to put in this period if the shock happens to be high? All right. And so let's notice that, so let me just give a name to that effort level. I'll call it A for the moment, but really it's A of that history. And so I've told you that what's happening on path is that the politician is choosing A if the shock is high and 0 if the shock is low. Now let's notice that it's without loss for me to think about all outcomes that are strictly less than A being treated the same. Right? So basically, however I was going to treat an outcome of 0, let me treat all of the outcomes less than A just as if they were 0. All I'm doing now is throwing away some incentive constraints because I'm just making sure that those outcomes are never those effort levels are never tempting. And similarly, if I wanted to induce A, I may as well not reward the politician for getting me an outcome strictly greater than A. Okay, so without loss, I'm treating all failures the same and all successes the same. And so now, if I'm treating all failures the same and I'm treating all successes the same, the only IC constraint that's left is the IC at a given history is that the politician would rather choose their equilibrium prescribed effort A, given a high shock. They would rather choose that than choose 0 in the current period. Okay, that's the only relevant one-shot deviation that's left for my politician. And so I'll sometimes lazily call that incentive constraint A being IC. So now the one other observation that I want to make that's without loss as far as voter payoffs are concerned is, so I said I have a public randomizing device sitting around. And so because of that, it's trivial that my equilibrium payoff profiles, that these things form a convex set. Turns out in our baseline model, you could show this even without a public randomizing device, but anyway, so my equilibrium payoff profiles form a convex set, and therefore, if I were going to offer you this continuation payoff for success and this continuation payoff for failure, I could make them closer together in a mean preserving way until IC binds. And so I could find an alternative equilibrium that generates the same payoffs for my voter and remains IC. And so this says that without loss, this IC constraint is always binding. All right. So all of these, super easy and kind of standard observations get us, I would say, remarkably close to understanding the form of voter optimal equilibrium. Right. So let me. How are we going to do it? So we're going to take the standard recursive approach, and we're going to think of everything as a dynamic program in which the politician's continuation value, the politician in office, their continuation value, is our state variable. All right, so let me call that continuation value U. So what range of values could you take for a politician in office? Well, the best thing I can offer them is to say, you're going to be in office no matter what you do. I'm never going to fire you. So this is tenure. And then what will the politician do? Not meaning to implicate any tenured people on the call, they will shirk indefinitely. They'll pay no cost of effort, and they'll get their office benefit every period, so their outcome is 1. Now, what's the worst thing I can do to an in-office politician? I can tell them, you're fired next period, no matter what you do. Well, then the thing they would optimally do is shirk in the current period and just collect 1 period of office benefit, and their continuation value would be 1 minus delta. All right, so now if we think about the feasible continuation values of a politician in general, that's going to range from 0 to 1. But for a politician who's in office in the current period, it ranges from 1 minus delta to 1. All right, so let me kind of black box the observations of the previous slide to describe the law of motion of politician continuation values. Okay, so what I want to ask is, what would be a politician's average continuation value from tomorrow if her continuation value from today onward is U, if her equilibrium prescribed effort in the current period is going to be A, which means she puts in A if the shock is high and 0 if the shock is low. If the public outcome turns out to be Y, so if the voter that's delivered to the payoff the payoff delivered to the voter turns out to be Y, and if we make IC bind in the sense that I described it binding on the previous slide. Okay, well, first let me just let's count equations and unknowns, and notice that I should be able to get a formula for this, right? My 2 equations are promise keeping, that my continuation value from today is actually U if I piece it together from the continuation values from tomorrow and the prescribed effort. That's one equation. And the other equation is that I'm indifferent between working and shirking when the shock is high. And the 2 unknowns are the success continuation value and the failure continuation value. So I have 2 equations, 2 unknowns. We should be able to piece it together, but we can actually interpret what these things are. So first, let me focus on the failure payoff. Okay, so so notice I'm keeping my politician indifferent between working and shirking. What that means is that their continuation value could be computed as if they shirk, even though I'm going to want them to work, right? That they would be indifferent between working and shirking. And so in particular, it's optimal for them to shirk. So if they shirk, their continuation payoff is going to be their shirking continuation their failure continuation payoff. And so And so what that means is, so how would I compute it? I take what I owe them today, I subtract off their office benefit from today. They're not exerting, if they shirk, they're not suffering any cost of effort, and I renormalize this for discounting. All right, and so it's easy to compute without thinking about their equilibrium prescribed effort, what their continuation payoff has to be given binding IC from a failure. Now, what about their continuation payoff from succeeding? Well, for that, I'm going to use binding IC and basically note that the difference between their failure payoff and their success payoff has to be equal to their cost of effort normalized for discounting. Right? It's basically, I have to make them exactly indifferent between the myopic costs of A units of effort and the value of having success continuation payoff rather than failure continuation payoff. All right. And so this gives us an exact formula for the average continuation payoff that the that the politician has to have tomorrow, if for a failure and for a success, if A is the effort I want to get out of them today. All right, so now I've characterized everything other than everything of substance, right? I still haven't told you what effort I want them to induce and when I want to fire them. And so now let me give you the kind of the first main result of the paper that characterizes it turns out to be unique up to the path of play, voter optimal equilibrium. And so basically, what I want to do, you don't need to look at this algebra. So let me start off by saying I'm going to start a newly elected politician at the lowest possible continuation payoff. Right. So what that's telling me is that it doesn't mean that they're definitely going to be fired between their first and second period. But what it means is I'm subjecting them to such high-powered incentives to within my abilities that they're actually going to be indifferent to the world in which I was going to fire them for sure between their first and second period. And in particular, something that this is going to end up implying is that if they fail their first term, they're going to be fired. So here's where I start a newly elected politician. Now, what effort level am I going to have them put in? So we have an explicit formula for it, but I think better than the formula is if I tell you how to interpret it. So the way we want to interpret this effort level is, so given a continuation value that I owe the voter, what this A is it is the highest possible effort that I could incentivize for a politician subject to promise keeping an IC. So I'm getting the highest effort level out of them that I possibly could. I'm going to fill this in a picture on the next slide, and that'll hopefully make it even a little clearer. But basically, this is the highest effort level such that if I told them you're going to get tenure if you give me exactly this outcome, and you're going to be fired if you give me any other outcome, this is the highest effort level such that putting in that effort level would be IC. What I just said is, I think I just said something wrong. Yeah, sorry. So I retract the last sentence. But anyway, this is the highest effort level such that it's feasible for me to give them a continuation value of U from this period and make it IC to put in that effort level. Okay, and so now we have from the previous slide, given the effort level, we have an exact formula for what is the average continuation value of the politician from tomorrow onward as a function of the outcome from today. So what do I mean by average? I mean, well, I have to decide whether to fire them between this period and the next period, and their continuation value is going to be 0 if I fire them, and something weakly higher than this V if I retain them, in such a way that average value adds up to V. And so now my firing rule is I'm going to fire them as little as I can get away with in the current period, subject to providing them an average continuation value of V. All right. Now, the important features of this voter optimal equilibrium are, so as I said, we start, well, yeah, I think everything here I've actually said. So yeah, so let me show you a picture. All right, so here I have my set of continuation values drawn. Okay, so it goes from 1 minus delta up to 1 for an in-office politician. And so what am I going to do? I'm going to start a newly elected politician at this continuation value of 1 minus delta. All right, so now I'm going to ask them to put the highest effort level that I can incentivize. So let me suppose that I think this corresponds to delta being higher than C over 1 plus C. But basically, let me just, so that the picture has more stuff going on, let me make delta high enough that it's possible to incentivize an effort of 1. So what I'm going to do is I have computed from A equals 1. I have my success continuation payoff and my failure continuation payoff. And so I'm going to ask the politician to put in an effort of 1 if the shock is high. And if they give me an outcome of 1, their value will jump to here. If they give me a value of 0, their value will jump to here. So if they give me a value of 0 and it jumps to here, then they're fired for sure, and I get a new politician. Say they succeed. So now they have a continuation value here. So now again, I'm going to try to get them to put in the highest effort I can. Say that effort is 1. And so now they have a new success payoff that's higher than their current continuation payoff and a new failure payoff. Suppose they fail. Now I owe them from today onward, or like from tomorrow onward, I owe them on average a continuation payoff of where the blue dot is, which is strictly between 0 and 1 minus delta for these parameters. So now notice that it's not feasible for me to satisfy promise keeping if I'm going to retain them for sure, right? I have to fire them with positive probability this period because we know that an in-office politician gets a continuation payoff of at least 1 minus delta. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, with some probability, fire them, and with complementary probability, start their career afresh at 1 minus delta in such a way that their continuation value averages to this. All right, so now suppose they have like a big string of successes, and now their continuation value is quite high. So now it's no longer feasible for me to provide this high continuation value while incentivizing an effort of 1. And so what do? Well, I have the same failure payoff as before. That didn't depend on which effort level I was inducing. And my success continuation payoff is going to be 1, which corresponds to tenuring the agent, the politician. And so now I'm going to, and the effort level that I'll ask out of them is exactly the effort level that makes IC bind given this failure payoff and this success payoff. And so now say they succeed, now they're tenured, all right? Now they're going to be in office no matter what they do, and in particular, they're going to shirk forever from now onward, all right? So here I have kind of a couple simulated paths of politicians' continuation values through their life in office. And so, the things to observe are, well, 1, some of them eventually don't make it, some of them get fired, and some of them eventually get tenured. Another thing to notice, this is true broadly in an asymptotic sense, but is not true literally as a comparative static due to integer issues. But broadly, their job security, which I can now codify with their continuation value, their job security on average increases over time. Again, this is only kind of asymptotically true, but we can see that it happens in some sense in this picture. And now another thing that I want to point out is that because it's stochastic, whether I make it or not, whether I get tenured or eventually get fired, and I get a fresh draw on this process from each new politician, the voter optimal equilibrium has the feature that eventually, with probability 1, some politician is tenured. All right? Now, I want to point out that this isn't, purely the stuff of science fiction. With apologies for the American-centric example here, there are some politicians whose job security is extreme. Right now, in particularly extreme cases, this job security can extend beyond the grave. So what's now, I believe, Michigan's 12th congressional district has had contiguously John Sr., John Jr., and Debbie Dingell for a collective, I think it's 88 collective years of Dingell representation in Congress. And so, all right, now here we have some sort of descriptive statistics saying that, not just that entrenchment happens, but, broadly it increases, it increases with time in office. Now, again, this is just, just cross-sectional. And moreover, I don't want to give the impression that we think a pure moral hazard model is the reason that political entrenchment happens. There are many, alternative causes for it that have been studied both empirically and theoretically. The thing I want to say is that given that entrenchment is endemic in this purely normative benchmark, we should, I guess what that means is that if we see entrenchment happening and we want to infer that, political accountability is not at work, that means that we're actually making a non-trivial identifying assumption, and in particular, an identifying assumption that rules out the normative benchmark of voter optimal equilibrium. And so we think that's a useful interpretation to bring when thinking about empirical literature that looks at other causes of entrenchment and more generally other causes of dynamics to political careers. Now, I should
Thing about the length of time necessary to get to entrenchment, because I'm thinking about how long should it be till we have tenure. It seems like if delta is very high, it should be well in the future. Possibly if C is small, it would be well in the future. I'm thinking. Could you compare to statics with respect to the parameters, or have you thought about that?
I mean, I think getting exact comparative statics would be hard in this discrete time model. I think we could get I suspect it wouldn't be hard for us to get sort of limit results about if delta is close to 0, if delta is close to C, but I haven't thought about it. As far as getting anything like quantitative results, like analytical quantitative results, I think I can confidently say there's no hope of us being able to get that. But in any case, it's something we haven't studied. So let me now turn to, I guess, all right, so what we've seen is that entrenchment is a really, is a necessary feature of voter optimal equilibrium. And in particular, it happens, not just after some histories, but it happens on path with probability 1. And so this is a bad outcome for the voter ex post. And so, I think given that entrenchment is, giving this first worst outcome to the voter, I think it's natural to wonder, will the voter put up with this? All right, now, if we take the most, traditional view as theorists on thinking about commitment power, then the answer is easy, right? I'm not requiring any commitment power out of my voter. This is an equilibrium, right? It's an equilibrium for me to put up with this entrenched politician who's putting in no effort, because if I were to fire them and get another politician, that politician would put in no effort as well. But we may think that this equilibrium model is not capturing all there is to limited commitment. And so we want to think a little bit about what would happen if voters could renegotiate away from bad continuation outcomes. And so what we want to think about is a simple model of renegotiation that has some foundation that I'll tell you a bit about, but in which the voter is going to be able to renegotiate away from continuation play whenever the continuation payoff for the voter is low enough, right? And so we want to look at the class. So we'll just take, for now, I'll just think of it as a parameter, but we can endogenize it. So I want to think about, there's just some lower bound on voter payoffs, and we want to think about what does a voter optimal equilibrium look like among all equilibria in which the voter's continuation payoff stays above pi lower bar, right? And so it turns out that this constrained optimal voter equilibrium takes a very, very similar form to the type of equilibrium that the previous proposition discussed. So basically, we're going to add one parameter, which is a u hat, which is going to be an upper bound on the politician's continuation payoff. And what we're going to solve for is the voter optimal equilibrium among those that keep the politician's payoff universally below u hat. And so first, it turns out that this class of this optimal equilibrium is equivalent to optimizing subject to this constraint, which tells us that explicitly limiting entrenchment is in some sense the optimal way to protect voter welfare. But in addition to that, we have an explicit solution following almost identical arguments for what this voter optimal equilibrium subject to this u hat constraint is. And it's, again, I'm going to always make IC bind. I'm going to fire you as little as possible, subject to promise keeping. And I'm going to make IC bind. I'm going to make the highest, and I'm going to get out of you the highest effort that I can, subject to promise keeping, IC, and never letting your continuation value go above u hat, which limits how high my reward payoff can be. But otherwise, we get very similar dynamics with just a softer form of entrenchment, because when my continuation payoff as a politician is exactly u hat, I'm not perfectly tenured. It's sort of, I'm at u hat, I'm asked to put in a low amount of effort, and if I succeed, I stay at u hat, and if I fail, I get kicked down to a failure payoff. But if u hat is close to 1, the place I get kicked down to is not being kicked down that much. And so this is all this is saying. Now, I should point out that there's a sense in which I'm cheating when I say this exhibits similar dynamics to our voter optimal equilibrium. And the reason is that if u hat happened to be equal to 1 minus delta, then I've just written the stationary Farragon equilibrium in an obnoxiously ornate way. So this thing, if u hat is 1, I have our voter optimal equilibrium. If u hat is 1 minus delta, I have the stationary equilibrium. And I would say we have something with similar dynamics to our equilibrium if u hat is that's distinct if u hat is interior. And so this leads us to want to know, is u hat equal to 1 minus delta or not? Do we get dynamics out of stationary, from a credibility concern? Sort of from a renegotiation concern. Now, to ask that in a fair way, we should be asking about this for the endogenized value of pi lower bar. So how should we endogenize this pi lower bar? Now here, we're going to take a page from David Pearce's book, which I think is typically a good decision in life. We're going to adapt his version of renegotiation proofness. So here's the idea. So we want to ask, when am I motivated to renegotiate? So it's when my continuation value is too low and I can convince you to move to an alternative equilibrium where my continuation payoff is higher. But when should my speech that we should move to a new equilibrium, when should it be credible? Well, first, let me give kind of what seems like a weak sufficient condition for a speech to be credible. Well, it should be that if the new equilibrium is history by history better for me than the current equilibrium, than the current continuation value I'm facing, it should be, you should really believe me if I say I want to move to this new equilibrium. Now, what about in the complementary? Yes.
I just want to say you have about 5 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So now what if this property isn't satisfied? Suppose I make a speech, we should move to this alternative better equilibrium, but suppose that the alternative equilibrium entails a continuation value after some histories that's lower than the current continuation value away from which I'm renegotiating. Well, then my new equilibrium, sows the seeds of its own destruction. You should think, okay, you're saying this is what we're going to renegotiate to, but when we get to this alternative history, I know you're just going to make the same speech. And so the current renegotiation shouldn't be credible. And so what Pearce does is he says, or what an adapted version of Pearce would say, is that if I combine these two, I should be looking at pi lower bar as the highest possible pi lower bar that could be induced, right? So basically, we're going to look at an equilibrium that's renegotiation proof. We're going to say it's renegotiation proof if it maximizes the minimum voter continuation value over all histories. Now, if we do that, we get a result that gives us sufficient parametric conditions for us to be able to prove that U hat is strictly greater than 1 minus delta. And the interpretation I want you to have for this is that credibility concerns, contrary to, leading us to stationary equilibria, we have sufficient conditions for them to explicitly preclude stationary play. Okay, so I'm hopelessly out of time, but let me give you a minute each on these two, big extensions of the model. One is we think about a model in which politicians collect outside offers while they're in office, receive outside offers while they're in office, but that stochastically arrive. And in the interesting case, these outside offers are such that I would reject some offers and accept some offers if they were, if I had an equilibrium in which my continuation value is evolving. So we characterize voter optimal equilibria in this extended version of the model. And we see that they take a broadly similar form, but the main insight that I want to deliver with this application, or advertise from the paper and hope you'll read it, is that sometimes I want to explicitly avoid entrenchment and explicitly keep the politician's continuation value low enough that they will accept every outside offer they get. And the reason that I do so is because letting the private sector reward a politician for past successes, basically letting the private sector reward them for remaining in office, is a cost-effective way from the voter's perspective to reward politicians. And lastly, we look at a version of the model in which politicians can either be high types who are like in our baseline model, or low types who are unable to produce a success. And we show that when you combine the special features of our model, you can actually make this model quite tractable and solve up to one parameter for voter optimal equilibrium, and it looks very similar to before. The main thing that I want to highlight here is that the existing literature teaches us that there should be no sanctioning selection trade-off if effort and ability are complements. But what we find is that by looking at a truly dynamic model, so not a two-period model, but a model with rich dynamics of political accountability, even though we're modeling effort and ability as complementary, this trade-off resurfaces between sanctioning and selection. And the intuition is that, so consider the continuation payoff that I'm going to give a politician who in their first term was successful and therefore proved themselves to be high ability. Consider the continuation payoff I'm going to give them. Well, if I make that continuation payoff high, that's costly to me because in expectation, I'm going to get less effort out of my current politician. If I make it too low, that's costly to me because in expectation, I will sooner have to go back to the pool to where there are untested politicians. And so we generate a novel trade-off between today's sanctioning and tomorrow's selection. And this affects the way newly elected politicians are treated in the model. Okay, so since I have gone a minute over time already, I will skip most of what I wanted to say on this slide. The one thing I want to say is that because basically we've seen in our paper new lessons about political accountability that we can only see because we're looking at a genuinely dynamic model and not restricting to stationary equilibrium. And we hope that what this teaches is that if we take this classic model that's literally older than I am, and we take the training wheels off of it, then what's left over is a versatile, tractable framework for thinking about political accountability and various forces that interact with the dynamics of political accountability. Okay, so thank you for your time, and especially for the 2 minutes that I've stolen from you at the end. So thanks.
Not at all. Yeah, it was a pleasure. These extra 2 minutes also. Now maybe let's start first with the panelists. So Peter already said he has a question. So maybe let's start with Peter. People in the audience can also think about if they have a question that they want to ask live. I think you can raise your hand if that's a possibility here, or write in the chat. All right.
And I want to complain about Elliot making me feel old.
Noted.
So great. So thanks a lot, Elliot. So just when I see the presentation, I feel even more sorry for Dennis Skinner, who was an MP for Bolsover for 49 years, continuously before losing his seat in 2019. So bad luck, Dennis. So very quick question about unequal discounting for voters and politicians, because in the moral hazard setting, I suppose, the voter is punished immediately if she deviates. So in principle, she could have a discount factor of 0, I suppose. But even in your selection and sanctioning model, because effort and ability are products, the sanctioning of the voter is also instantaneous in that variation. So to what extent can you accommodate unequal discounting in that variation? People often complain about voters being far-sighted, but I think you can cheaply, or maybe I should say inexpensively, address that pretty easily in your framework.
Yeah, I mean, I think so, especially because, sometimes in dynamic moral hazard models, if you make the agent, if you make the agent more patient than the principal, things explode. If you make the agent less, no, I said it right. Yeah, if you make the agent more patient than the principal, then things explode. But here, because there are no transfers, that could be done. And I think similar analysis should give, qualitatively similar dynamics, although our exact optimum wouldn't be exactly optimal. I think the arguments that let us bridge from the the way of thinking about the pure moral hazard model to the model with adverse selection, because of the very, very specific adverse selection model we've used. I don't think those arguments would be sensitive to having asymmetric discounting or anything, or even making the voter purely myopic. It's like they're not quantitative arguments. It's really just that if I were going to, so basically, we prove a lemma here. Actually, I think I have this lemma in here, that I'm optimally going to replace a politician that fails their first term. And the idea is, if somebody has failed their first term, I'm going to give, I've weakly learned something bad about them. And so I get a fresh draw from the pool if I fire them. And so I may as well do that if it weren't having any impact on incentives. But this is only going to help incentives. And so given this, the entire recursive analysis takes place with a politician in hand who is perfectly vetted as being good. Now you can ask about am I willing to part with this politician who is vetted as good, especially if I'm, I guess, so again, the answer to this question sort of has nothing to do with my discount factor. Am I willing to part with them? Well, my behavior is observable. And so if I was supposed to behave in a certain way and I didn't, we can have a bad equilibrium. And so, yeah, I think the part of our analysis where I think we might get some cool stuff that would be, novel relative to what's in the paper if we were thinking about asymmetric discounting. Again, this is, treat everything I'm saying as a guess because we haven't formally done anything with asymmetric discounting. But is the renegotiation stuff, and in particular renegotiation with endogenous outside option. But yeah.
Right. So Richard, do you have anything, any comment or question?
So I guess, one question I had about the renegotiation part. So it's very nice, and everything in this paper is very beautifully done. So I wait until the end for the effusive praise. But even though you make me feel old, great job on the paper. What I was wondering in terms of the renegotiation was, we know there are a lot of renegotiation proof notions, and here, to some sense, it seems like, and this becomes maybe a little bit informal as to what the right notion is, but if I'm the voter and there's a politician, I can always just make a different deal with a different politician to replace them. And so in some sense, the other politician can come along and say, hey, you're electing this old incumbent. If you elected me instead, the continuation play is much better because I'm the new guy who has to prove him, who's in the early stage where I haven't built the goodwill. And so I was thinking, so on one level, you could imagine if you took the pi lower bar, if you interpreted that as the payoff from a newly elected person in that equilibrium, what would happen then? And sort of related to that, imagine that if I'm what I was thinking here is sort of like a cooperative game theory kind of thing where we can make side deals, but you could just imagine that the Y is not observed by anybody else, so the voter always has the option to deviate for different Ys if they wanted to pretend, I was happy about last time, so I replace this old guy who I didn't want in earlier stages. Would that change the analysis very much?
I think yes, but I think I think what you'd run into is so I think we would run into the core being non-empty in the majority game. So notice that there's exactly one politician collecting office benefits in any given period, and effort is a transfer from the, so say, let me multiply the voters payoff by C, which is just, strategically irrelevant. And so now literally effort is a transfer from one politician to the voter. And so I'm looking at a constant sum game with infinity plus one players. And so like, if you're going to ask for something that sort of allows for coalitional deviations, sure, you can patch it so that it's going to be a non-empty valued solution concept. And probably for most patches that I would throw there to make it non-empty valued, we're going to end up somehow getting the result that we're stuck with an always shirk equilibrium. That's just a guess. But basically, I think this being a constant sum game makes it so that renegotiation is sort of either going to do everything or do nothing.
So I was thinking of it. I agree that makes sense. I was thinking of it in terms of, well, if the continuation play from replacing the incumbent is lower than from keeping the incumbent, would that sort of push towards the stationary equilibrium? Then I just replace the incumbent, and so would that just lead to a situation where we get back to the stationary equilibrium?
So yeah, so I think so. If you're that would be my guess, and we can kind of think of it as it's kind of like a unilateral by the voter, or think of it as multilateral by the voter and the next politician, but either way, like unilateral by the voter, like Bernheim-Ray style renegotiation proofness. I share your intuition that something like that should push toward the stationary equilibrium. But if you're not going to do that unilateral, if you're not going to do the patch to make it unilateral, or again, multilateral by 2 out of the infinity players, then I think Bernheim-Ray style renegotiation proofness is going to select nothing because the game is constant sum. I think that's all I had.
Thank you.
So are there any other questions also from the general audience or the organizers, or also Peter again?
Can I ask one?
Sure.
Yeah. So in many cases there are term limits. How do you think this would affect the dynamics? Have you thought at all about?
So given that of course what we're so aside from term limits being realistic, in various papers, term limits are used as a way of avoiding looking at infinite horizon games, but you could still ask, can I make my recursive analysis go with term limits? And so now you would end up having a state variable that's the number that's politician continuation value and maximum number of terms remaining. It should be easy to show, silly things like as the number of terms goes to, allowable terms goes to infinity, you can approximate our optimal contract well. You should be able to get some of the qualitative structure and meaningful comparative statics in the term limit, I would guess. And basically, I think this isn't a putting term limits in isn't going to turn things. Maybe this is the heart of the question. Isn't going to be like converting an infinitely repeated prisoner's dilemma into a finitely repeated prisoner's dilemma.
Yeah, well,
The passing to the commitment solution for the voter is still going to be a valid transformation by similar reasoning, and it will still be the case that and basically the difference between infinite horizon and finite horizon slash long finite horizon settings is much smaller in principal agent problems than in games. And so I guess I kind of but I don't have much to say on how it would meaningfully change things. One thing that I would point out that's a way in which we speak to term limits is, so I guess I don't think I have anywhere to go for it, but the renegotiation results, I think protecting voter welfare in some sense is one justification given for term limits. It's sort of saying we want to limit entrenchment in order to protect voters, or protect the electorate. And so I would say our results say that that's right in one way and wrong in another. So that's right in the sense that the fact that securing a voter continuation value lower bound is optimally implemented by imposing a politician continuation value upper bound exactly says that limiting entrenchment is the optimal way to protect voters, and so it's not and so in that sense this this role for term limits is correct. The sense, if I were to take my model way too literally, perhaps the sense in which this our model shows it's incorrect is we solve for the optimal way to do that, and it's not a term limit. It's something else. This U-hat is sort of like a time varying, history dependent thing that feels kind of like a term limit, but it's not a term limit.
Right. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Right, so we are at the end of the official time, so I guess we can stop recording, right, Anpet? And thank you very much again, but we can hang around.